Okay, give me. All right. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining the EDI Network and the Urban Design Knowledge Committee for our initial discussions regarding justice in the built environment. Next slide, please. I am Tony Ransom, one of the 3 co-chairs of the EDI Network, and our agenda for tonight includes an overview of the guides and several case studies. Next. For those who have not attended our meetings or events, the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Network is a place for individuals in the design industry to engage in meaningful conversations and to share best practices related to issues of EDI within the profession. Next. The BSA Urban Design Committee explores big ideas about cities. Next. I would now like the other representatives of the EDI Network and the Urban Design Committee to introduce themselves. You can take it in the order that is currently listed on the slide.
I'm Dave Riccadelli. I'm one of the other co-chairs of the EDI Network.
I'm Rachel Zamberi. I'm the 3rd co-chair for the EDI Network.
I'm Rami Samahi. I'm the co-chair of the Urban Design Committee.
And Martin Zogren, also co-chair of the Urban Design Knowledge Committee.
We also have a guest presenter who I would like to introduce himself.
I think that'd be me.
That'd be you, Wendell. Yeah.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Wendell Joseph, project planner at Tool Design Group, which is a firm that specializes in transportation planning and engineering. So thank you for having me here tonight.
All right. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. As you may be aware, the AIA published its guides for equitable practice in 2017 and have released 2 supplementary guides in 2022. This year, we would like to use several of our events to focus on the Justice in the Built Environment Guide. For this session, we are collaborating with the Urban Design Committee to look at environmental justice from an urban design lens. Okay, next slide. During our first year of operation, several contributors from the BSA and Boss Noma helped us to summarize the guide for ethical practice into the EDI resource guide, which, along with other resources, are available on the BSA website. Dan, would you like to talk about the session engagement rules?
Sure. Yeah. So we put these up at all of our meetings, just 4 rules about conversation. And really what we want to highlight is that in all our conversations, we want to listen to learn, not to be reinforced. We'll be recording the presentation portion of the session, but any feedback portions will not be recorded. And you'll see the symbol at the bottom so you know.
Okay. If you like, Dan, I'll continue. Okay. Over the past few years, the public has become acutely aware of long-standing injustices and inequities that have filtered their way into the built environment. The Justice in the Built Environment Supplementary Guideline is intended to help designers convey the opportunities, the benefits, and the challenges that we will face in making justice a deliberate aim of the building process. It focuses on elevating a designer's skills in facilitating that necessary and possibly uncomfortable dialogue between the various stakeholders to help the designer develop that persuasive power necessary to help lead others to a meaningful change. Okay. If you would like to move forward to the historic foundations slide, and if you like to take over at that point, Dan, you may. If not, I can continue.
Sure. No, I'll take over.
Okay.
Yeah. So those first two slides that Rachel just kind of flipped through were just a quick summary of what the guide defines as the different types of justice: design justice, environmental justice, social justice, racial and ethnic justice, and financial justice. All of these are sort of intermingled, but each of them has their own different definition that's listed here. And what's interesting is that, when we talk about design and urban design, which we're talking about today, it touches many or most of these different component parts. So there's sort of all considerations for us as designers as we start thinking about how to make our designs more just. Next slide. So a good portion of the guide, the whole middle chunk, is sort of dedicated to the historic foundations of injustice, sort of where we came from. And so we did our best to kind of translate this into the things that are most salient, being designers in Boston. And so we sort of categorized it into four sort of formative points that were the historic foundations of injustice here in our community. And the first of which is racially restrictive covenants. So, just going back in history, from the 1920s until 1948, when they were banned by the Supreme Court, it was commonplace to have covenants on deeds of land that were explicitly restrictive, not only to purchase, but to live or to lease land in and around Boston. So these were deed covenants that were actually then passed on as someone sold the property, and they were explicitly discriminatory, often calling out specific races that were not allowed to live in those properties. So the history of this is pretty pervasive still in Boston, and in fact, in some deeds you can still find these, even though they are certainly not legal anymore. But the history of these is kind of part of the fabric of our neighborhoods. The next historic foundation of injustice is redlining. And this is probably the one that people know about the most out of the four that we categorized here. But this is the overt practice of denying mortgages based upon racial and ethnic composition of an area without regard for financial ability or creditworthiness. The specific term was derived from the red line, which financial institutions would use as the barrier between where they would and would not invest. And I put an example on the right here of the Boston security map, and this is what they call the maps that they use to designate which neighborhoods were good for investment and which neighborhoods were not allowed for investment. So these are sort of the red line maps that form the backbone of the discrimination that happened. And this was sanctioned by the FHA and was still in place until the Fair Housing Act banned it in 1968. So pretty recent history that this form of discrimination occurred. The next one that we highlighted here is restrictive land use regulations. So this is a sort of interesting. It's sort of interesting how this came to be. Partly, it was because of the development of the highway rings around Boston here, both 128 and 495, which gave greater access to the city from the suburbs. And so with that move to the suburbs jobs, opportunities, new housing, all of that was happening outside of the city of Boston. And it spurred what they referred to as the white flight of people, white people leaving the city and moving to these suburbs. And as this happened, suburbs around Boston started enacting zoning policies. And I listed a couple of examples here below. But these zoning policies were sort of intentionally restrictive. They were aimed at making sure that lower income people, people from the city that couldn't afford to live in their communities weren't able to do so. You know, the examples are large minimum lot requirements, limiting multifamily housing, specifically in some cases barring affordable housing, age-restricted housing, and limits on density. And you know, it says here 1950s to present because most of these zoning laws that were enacted during these periods are still in effect in suburban communities around the city of Boston. And just for context, I kind of leaned on the Fair Housing Center of Greater Boston for a bunch of these facts. So if you want a little more information, they have some great links and resources there. And then just to sort of to tie a bow around the historic foundations of injustice, I wanted to bring up housing discrimination today. And so, you know, I think that it's important to recognize that even though some of the discriminatory processes and laws that we just brought up here are no longer allowed, they're illegal because they're discriminatory, that there is discrimination specifically in housing that still occurs today. Data shows that Black and Latinx buyers and renters are shown fewer homes, quoted loan rates that are higher than their white counterparts. In addition, low-income renters and families are discriminated against in 2/3 of housing applications when they're seeking rental housing. So as a yes, next slide, please. So as sort of a call to action here, I put up this this quote from the guide. And the reason that I liked it was because it mentions that as designers, we can create a more just process through both the process itself and the end product. And so the way we do this is by realizing that there's no one-size-fits-all solution for development, and that would be an answer to these issues. And rather, we need to engage with the community and the stakeholders to better understand and address their needs in a more holistic way. And with that, I would like to hand it off, I think, to Martin to do a little introduction and take us into our first case study.
Sure. Thanks so much, Dan. I think as a background, that was excellent to sort of think through some of the, you know, not so long ago history that has really affected the livelihood of so many people in the cities across the United States, certainly, and as well in here in the city of Boston itself. So just as a very short introduction, it was my privilege a few years ago to work alongside Wendell Joseph on a project that was sponsored by the Sasaki Foundation. And the impetus was really to look at the intersection between certain communities, and Wendell will explain this, but certain communities in gateway cities in and around the Boston area and their access to a whole range of mobility options. This is work that took place over a number of months. We did everything we could in the examples and in the work that we had to really reach out to those communities, as difficult as it was during the pandemic, to get their take and understanding of some of the challenges they face on something as fundamental as access to transportation. So Wendell is here to share the website with you all. And so as a way of introduction and a great amount of gratitude to Wendell for joining us this evening. So go ahead, Wendell.
Thank you very much, Martin. Again, it's a pleasure to be with you all this evening, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about this project that took up a good deal of time and focus and a lot of hard work from a lot of different people, most of whom are not on this call this evening. So I do want to, as I share my screen, start off with that by just shutting out the the whole team, and it included planners, data analysts, and technologists and others, and so this really is a group effort. So I'll get into it. What is Get There? So I first want to start talking about our approach, starting with the what. And this, aligns well with the overview that the historical overview that Dan just gave us. Uneven access and experiences with mobility is an issue in the Boston metro region. There have been a lot of efforts at the state and local level to address those inequities, but the legacy of discriminatory community development policies and practices continues to influence the flow of capital and the investments made into the built environment. So this results in communities where there are considerable challenges in how residents move freely, safely, and comfortably. And so we saw these inequities play out in real time, obviously during the coronavirus pandemic at the beginning, when we were all in quarantine, when Boston neighborhoods that were most impacted by by COVID-19 were also those same neighborhoods that had the highest proportion of essential workers in the city, many of whom still relied largely on public transit to be able to get to work. As far as the where, as Martin mentioned, we wanted to focus our research on gateway cities. These communities have long been welcoming entry points into regional economies across the state for many, many people. However, while the state in general had witnessed an economic boom over the past decade or so, many cities and communities, including the 26 gateway cities, had not. So there was a huge disparity there. This disproportionately affected Black, Indigenous, and other persons of color or racialized minorities, as their share of the population within gateway cities has also increased in the past decade. And so the who. So with equity as the core value of this project, we also wanted to focus on people in communities that have been harmed and disrupted by their environment. Today, the state defines environmental justice communities or populations as census block groups that meet one or more of the following criteria. And these criteria have to do with household income, race and ethnicity, and English proficiency. And there are various thresholds for each of those criteria. So one thing that I think is important to know in talking about EJCs or environmental justice populations, quote unquote, is that I think it's important to note that these communities, these spaces, and the people that reside in them are not necessarily at risk or more susceptible to harm from their environment purely due to demographic or factors of socioeconomic statuses. Rather, it's the fact that the surrounding environment, built environment, the natural environment, so on and so forth, has been formed over time through laws, policies, and practices that cause harm. And so equitable investment in both people and the environment that surrounds them is critical to realizing cities and communities that are more cohesive and whole. So I think it's just a very important thing to note, because it's always a pet peeve of mine, no matter which space or which conversation I'm in, where the conversation around like justice in the built environment kind of like disproportionately focuses on people rather than the environment themselves, because the environment didn't just happen to be this way, right? But it's through time, through policies, that we've created an environment that disproportionately affects people based on race and ethnicity and age and gender and so on and so forth. So how do we go about this work? So for starters, we launched the interactive survey, which was an online activity where residents could share their experiences on how they got to the places that are most important to them, and allow us to learn about, and have them weigh in on the priorities and projects that they felt could make a difference in how they move through their communities. As Martin mentioned, when this project kicked off, it was like shortly after we were in quarantine, and so we had to drastically shift how we navigated this project. At first, we had a couple of workshops and charrettes set up where we would go into the communities and work with folks to talk through these issues. But we had to pivot pretty quickly and drastically, and so we put together this interactive survey to try to get some feedback on this work. And so this interactive survey was a big part of that. And then the communities that we did this work in, which was Lynn and Malden, we also provided this interactive survey in multiple languages. So English and Spanish and Khmer and I believe Chinese as well, Haitian Creole. There were a handful of languages that we had to translate the survey to just to make sure that we had as much input and participation as we possibly could. So as far as the focus areas, we want to share a little bit about how we navigated through our research questions, the data that we looked at, and how we incorporated those results from the interactive survey to the overall project. And so we looked at who was living in Lynn and Malden at the time. We looked at where people who are living in environmental justice communities, where they travel to, and how that can be compared to residents who don't live in environmental justice communities, and how they got there. So we also folded in math results from the interactive survey, which brought more of a nuanced and human element to the story. So qualitative and quantitative data. And the survey results gave us an idea of what matters most to people and how their journeys can improve. So to provide an example of what that looked like, here's a screenshot of one of the survey results sections from our website, which I'll scroll through in a little bit. So here we're only showing markers that were placed that had a comment attached to it. We were able to identify if some of the markers were placed by respondents who do live in environmental justice communities, as indicated by the circles that have the red outline. So you can kind of see, which is which. So there's a cluster of infrastructure-related comments around Lynn Central Station, for example, which is right down here. And those infrastructure-related comments cover topics that range from the condition of the station, this is the Lynn commuter rail stop, to sidewalk conditions around the station and in the downtown area. So there's also some more comments along Western Avenue, which is up here, and Linfield Street. And those comments, even though responses were limited in terms of the overall responses that we got from the surveys, and the respondents were not fully representative of the community itself from a racial, ethnic, age and gender point of view, we felt like the comments were still valuable in that the spatial patterns suggest that there was something there that needed to be looked in a little more, right? Something that warranted a greater level of investigation. So with each marker placed, as I showed in the previous slide, we took the comments that we received through the survey and grouped them into specific categories. So for Lynn, most of the markers indicated challenges associated with driving, and that's consistent with what data tells us about the number of residents in Lynn who depend on their personal vehicles to get from point A to point B. And infrastructure was the biggest challenge related to that. For Malden, however, most of the stakeholders indicated challenges associated with walking. And consequently, the biggest challenge revolved around safety. So the second part of the interactive survey was the prioritizing activity. And with that, we wanted to explore people's reasons for traveling and how important those reasons were to residents. And so here are the different categories there were. It's not fully comprehensive, as you can see, but we wanted to try to have as wide a range as possible. And so the way that this worked is using a total of 20 stars. Participants were asked to indicate which of those 8 options mattered to them most. In Lynn, getting to work and school and accessing essential businesses and services were among the top priorities. Again, this is consistent with what respondents pointed out earlier in the survey regarding traffic and safety, as well as the reality that driving is the predominant mode in Lynn. For the top priority, accessing recreational areas, We felt that further exploration might be required to understand, if residents are confirming that they don't take advantage of Lynn's natural and recreational spaces, or if there's like another factor at play that limits how often and people take advantage of these parks and open spaces. In Malden, accessing essential businesses and services and getting to work and school are top priorities, which again is more likely pertinent during this time when we were in quarantine. As we saw previously, many of the comments on mobility challenges revolved around walking, which is not the most popular mode of choice in Malden. So one possible explanation we thought was that major streets and corridors such as Center Street and Commercial Street that have a relatively high volume of traffic of all types may have an adverse impact on the pedestrian experience. Because these corridors are also ones that cut through, major commercial areas in Malden. So spatializing community engagement results in this way, along with priorities from the surveys, we felt would help guide our understanding of how access to mobility choices are experienced and perceived on the ground. And so with that, I'd say that mobility, obviously, as we know, is a complex and dynamic phenomenon. And it's a unique experience that varies widely from one neighborhood to the next and from one person to another. So as a result, engaging in work that is driven by equity requires analysis that is contextual and nuanced, and that disaggregates data. So that was the reason why, when we looked at data, we tried to parse it and pull it apart and try to look at how the data lined up when you looked at it spatially, comparing environmental justice communities, right, which are those census blocks compared to those that are not. So what our team aspired to accomplish was to share a narrative that analyzed existing data, but also began to look beyond it to explore the nuances of mobility that is experienced specifically by those living in environmental justice communities. And so, this work, this project, it wasn't a traditional planning project in where, there's a ton of recommendations and, next steps and so have you, but it was more about key questions. So there's questions, some of them are listed on the slide here, and we hope that the exploration of those key questions could continue at the local level to help direct conversations and decisions on equitable investments that acknowledge the margins of mobility access. So that's kind of just a quick overview of the site. I have it pulled up here, so what I can do is just kind of just scroll through. Obviously, you'll see some of the similar slides as before, but show you how that works. So we, again, talk a little bit about environmental communities, try to front load the site with as much contextual information as possible so folks can understand what we were doing. We were trying to go for like that, New York Times feel, where they have those, pretty, interactive and cool websites every now and then that, is kind of like broken up with pretty cool visuals and graphics and some narrative. And so we can click to Lynn, and then you'll see we have some background history or background information on Lynn, again, just to provide some context. And then we started with demographic information of who lives in Lynn. And there it is, broken down into a bar. And then here it is showing the split between environmental justice communities, so those census blocks that are EJCs and those that are not designated as EJCs. And actually you can see some of the splits in terms of race and ethnicity. And then we put that on a map. And you can kind of see how it breaks down. So this is Lynn over here. As you can see, a huge chunk of Lynn is the reservation up here. And so the most populous area is obviously right down here in the middle. And Lynn Central Station is right about here. So the majority of Lynn's population is, as you can see by these dots, concentrated right here in the center. And again, I have to shout out our strategies group, who are pretty great at all these visualization techniques with data analytics and all that kind of stuff. We could not have done this without their help. So here we started to look at, occupation, right? Just to kind of get a sense of, generally speaking, who works in what sector. Here it is in Lynn, specifically, gateway cities in the aggregate, and then just the metro statistical area. And then again, we did the same thing, right? This is kind of like a constant thing. Whenever we had like a pretty key data point, it was like, here it is on a big picture. Boom, here's how it breaks down across the different communities, again, to see what's different, what's the same, and again, how that may have an impact on how people experience mobility. Yeah, so I encourage people to check out the site. I mean, I won't scroll through the whole thing for the sake of time. I guess just one thing I'd say is again, while it is important to keep in mind, who people are that live in the communities that we do work in, again, to my earlier point, it's very important to keep in mind the environment itself, as it also has an impact on how folks experience in their city. I think in this case, because these are cities that are fairly densely populated, they're fairly built up. It's not like there's a huge disparity, right? Because by virtue of people living in proximity to a lot of different services, or maybe live along routes that are serviced by bus or by the T, and so on and so forth, the opportunities of getting from point A to point B are not without their challenges, but again, the degree to which that changes between those who live in environmental justice communities and those who do not may vary. And so this is one of those types of projects that we really just skim the surface of the conversation. I mean, as Martin said, we spent a handful of months on this. I mean, we're talking about a project that, in order for you to do a really, really deep dive, would be on the order of years. And so I think, we're definitely excited and proud of the work that we were able to accomplish in a short amount of time, especially during quarantine, where everybody's trying to figure out what to do. Yeah, I think it was just a way of demonstrating how to approach this work in a nuanced and contextual way. So with that, I'll stop sharing and pass the mic back to someone. I don't know who.
I can jump in here, unless Martin, there was anything else that you wanted to share about the study itself.
No, go ahead, Rachel. That's great.
Great. So I think we wanted to just take a little time to pause now, and I'm actually going to pause the recording as well.
Mind.
I'm going to turn the recording back on, and once I find the button, I will share my screen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rami. We're moving a little further away to a neighborhood in Pittsburgh that I had the pleasure of working on several years ago when I was teaching urban design studios at Carnegie Mellon. It always sort of has stuck with me, and I think it sort of was an interesting case study to discuss in this context. Larmer was a neighborhood on the east side of Pittsburgh, which in Pittsburgh in many ways has some similarities with some of the gateway cities that we've talked about. It's like a lot of the gateway cities, it was once an industrial hub that is now trying to find new ways to define itself after the industry has sort of left and the population and the economy have declined. But the east end of Pittsburgh, East Liberty being sort of the downtown, is just right next to Larmer. At one point, it was the third largest downtown in Pennsylvania after City Center, Philly, downtown the Golden Triangle in Pittsburgh. This was the third largest. Larmer itself was sort of home to sort of a northern Italian community, working class, but certainly comfortable lives and comfortable homes. By the 1960s, the population was largely African American, and that continues to today. At its height, it was a population of 13,000. Today is fewer than 1,300. Average median income well below the average AMI. and enormous rate of vacancy. Next, please. So you can see Larmer sort of in the middle of this, surrounded by East Liberty, Highland Park, Lincoln, Homewood, Point Breeze. And what you have here is that the darker the shade of the neighborhood, the more affluent it is. And the red, other than the tags, the red are vacant parcels or vacant buildings on parcels. So Larmer is right in the center, and you can see the amount of vacancy that there is there. Interesting also, Larmer sort of on its southern edge is Pennsylvania Avenue, before the Pennsylvania Turnpike connected, it was called the Lincoln Highway, connected Philadelphia all the way to Pittsburgh. So it was and continues to be a significant street. It is sort of on the southern edge of Larmer, and the southern portion of Larmer is sort of bisected by what's called the busway. It's a high-speed bus, rapid transit, that from East Liberty could get you downtown in under 15 minutes. So it's in some ways a very desirable location, despite its current state. Next, please. It's so desirable, in fact, that this area that is highlighted in this image has been kind of revamped and redeveloped as Bakery Square through private development. But they have, next please, they've been able to take advantage of quite successfully, with the help of the local renewal, the Urban Renewal Authority, and because it is technically in the neighborhood of Larmer, it was eligible for remediation funds, eligible for TIF funds, and as a result, the project was sort of kickstarted through public money because of its location in a distressed neighborhood, even though the project itself really is oriented in the other direction entirely, and is about connecting with East Liberty and the more affluent neighborhoods to the west, rather than the poorer neighborhoods to the east. In fact, the URA in some of its language, there's a great quote that thanks to public funding, this project, without public funding, this project wouldn't have been 1/10 the size of the development that now exists. So it's this interesting case study for us to discuss, perhaps because there was sort of a public and private partnership to take advantage of its location to access funding that would not have been available had it been elsewhere in the city, and yet off the back of the success of this project, the URA was able to develop over 300 units of affordable housing elsewhere in the neighborhood, and there's now sort of in phase 4 what is called a new living street that's being planned just on the back of the busway, and with plans to connect it with a bridge to Bakery Square. So to me, it's an interesting kind of case study, is like what a city felt it had to do sort of to make deals that, I guess there are lots of questions to be asked in this case that I thought were worthy of a discussion. So I'll leave it at that and open it for discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Rami. Any initial questions for Rami?
I mean, as Wendell was presenting and Martin was talking about the naming of things and the importance of naming things. And I think, in fact, this is a really good example of these things are named. This was a specific neighborhood, and as a result, it was able to tap, this project was able to tap into funds that were not necessarily, they couldn't have done either otherwise, which in some ways may not have been the original intent of the rules as they were set forth. So is it a deal with the devil? Is it cynical? Is it the best deal that the city could get for itself at that time? I'm trying to keep an open mind, and I think it's worth discussing. Sort of we live in an imperfect world, and as President Obama used to say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But what works for us as designers, because designers were complicit in this engagement.
I have a question about this, the development actually. I'm not sure, again, when this was opened, how much study's been able to happen since then, but was this designed, and have you found that the people in the community of Larimer are actually using this, or is it attracting folks from adjacent or communities or further afield in terms of the actual usability of the beautiful project that was actually developed?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I haven't been back in 5-6 years. When I was more engaged with the project, so the project sort of kicked off in 2007, and really kind of saw life maybe 2010. There were a lot of people who started to show up, but it was not folks from Larimer. There was nothing for them there. It was really oriented to the other direction, if you will. There is now, from what I read, and I haven't been back, there are sort of attempts to change that. This living street is an example of one of the things that's trying to be done as a result. To me, it feels like the folks in Larimer were not at the table until the table was set, and then quite astutely and loudly insisted on a place at the table. And now things are happening, but it wasn't the way. That wasn't the case at the beginning.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's interesting. I was actually just sitting in at a redevelopment board meeting in my town last night, where there was a new development presented, and just even talking with the abutting neighbors about what the planned retail tenants and were by the developer, in terms of whether or not they had engaged to really understand what the needs of and wants of the community were, versus